Welcome to Defiant Nation Radio, where we defy the narrative that our culture is feeding us. We defy the idea that the scriptures cannot be trusted, and we defy the idea that the God of the Bible does not exist. We defy the idea that we have evolved from monkeys. At Defiant Nation Radio, we uphold the solas of the Reformation. We uphold the scriptures. We believe that salvation is by grace alone, through faith alone, in Christ alone. Defiant Nation Radio is the podcast ministry of EternityAtStake.com.
Well, welcome to Defiant Nation Radio podcast. This is part 2 of the series that I'm doing here, a little 2-3-part series called With Socialism Comes Violence. And in the first part, I looked at scripture from Proverbs, the call for us to listen to wisdom, to get wisdom, and to get understanding. Talked about some violence in the news. And in this part 2, I want to look at violence that is called for through or from socialism, from Marxism. And if you don't understand what the difference of those things are, or what socialism is the underlying worldview, Marxism is a branch off of socialism, I want to just deal with and cover now some of the call for violence that is both organic, just being a part of socialism, and then instigated violence. Lenin, for this one, I'm going to read a number of quotes to you from different sources, and again, I'll have this in the notes on the blog page. But Lenin wrote in State and Revolution back in 1917, he said, "The dictatorship of the proletariat will produce a series of restrictions of liberty. In the case of the capitalists, we must crush them. Their resistance must be broken by force. There must also be violence, and there cannot be liberty or democracy." Now, before him was Trotsky. He's the one that I believe he led the Bolshevik Revolution. And so there's obviously violence upon violence upon violence. Stalin was Lenin's general secretary, and under his regime, detractors were deported or imprisoned in labor camps. It's part of the Great Purge. 1 million people were executed under Stalin's orders. So over and over and over again, people were executed. They're sent to the gulags. I mentioned the Gulag Archipelago, which is just story after story after story of people that had survived the gulags, or people who were in the gulags that were able to get their stories out. You should check it out sometime. Violence upon violence upon violence. By the way, when these guys came to power, they killed everyone who helped bring them to power. They killed all the radicals, all the leaders. They killed all the teachers that were teaching their worldview. They killed them. Under Chairman Mao Zedong's revolution, violence was carried out as part of his takeover. This is from the New York Times. It says the movement was fundamentally about elite politics, as Mao tried to reassert control by setting radical youths against the Communist Party hierarchy. But it had widespread consequences at all levels of society. Young people battled Mao's perceived enemies and one another as Red Guards before being sent to the countryside in the later stages of the Cultural Revolution. Intellectuals, people deemed class enemies, and those with ties to the West or the former nationalist government were persecuted. Many officials were purged. Some, like the future leader Deng Xiaoping, I believe is how you say his name, were eventually rehabilitated. It means they bought in hook, line, and sinker, or forced, tortured until they did. Others were killed, committed suicide, or were left permanently scarred. All right, I realize without in a revolution, you have bloodshed, but the question is, why is the revolution being carried out in these cases? This is because of socialism. It is because of Marxism. Rand Paul has a book coming out called The Case Against Socialism, and he points out that in the upcoming book, they note varying levels of socialism. So in a small quantity, it's just sort of, I threaten you with a fine, but there's no real follow-up. So in socialist government, socialist leadership, he explained, but when the government seeks to take away private property by force, that is when violence ensues. So the ultimate conclusion of socialism, where you really take people's property, people do resist and it becomes violent, and that's when you have the gulag. He said, pointing to history, whether it's Stalin or Hitler or Mao or Pol Pot, Maduro or Chavez, Castro, doesn't seem to be that there is a benign socialism out there. So the Democrats have tried to rebrand themselves or their brand as democratic socialism. It's the same socialism. I've heard someone said, just because you have a pile of poop and you put, candy sprinkles on top of it, it doesn't make it any more appetizing. You just now have sprinkles on a pile of poop. And so socialism is a godless, antichrist philosophy. A guy named, I don't know if it's Gorgas or Georges or George Sorel, might just be George Sorel, it's Georges, lived from 1847 to 1922. He would have a great effect on the application of Marxist thought in the late 1800s and early 1900s. So Marx, publishing his stuff through mid 1800s, so you have a timeline there. Ludwig von Mises, he notes this about Sorel. He says, Sorel belongs psychologically to the group of people who dream of action but never act. He didn't fight. As a writer, however, Sorel was very aggressive. He praised cruelty and deplored the fact that cruelty is more and more disappearing from our life. Sorel asked of the labor unions a new tactic. It was called action direct, which was attack, destroy, and sabotage. It was the idea of French syndicalism. All that is, syndicalism is another word for live revolution. That influenced the most important movement of the 20th century. Lenin, Mussolini, and Hitler. So you have communism, fascism, and Nazism there. They were all influenced by Sorel, by the idea of action, by the idea not to talk, but to kill. Do you understand? Are you getting the picture? Are you understanding what the call is for? There's a Hollywood movie that they had just started to advertise, and with these mass shootings, they pulled it back a little bit. I don't know if I assume they'll probably go ahead with it. I don't remember who was putting the big money behind it, but it was originally titled Red State versus Blue State, but now it's called The Hunt. And in this movie, socialist elites or blue state Democrats literally hunt deplorable Trump supporters, pro-life Trump supporters, for sport. That's what they do. They hunt them for sport. We've got problems, real problems. A little bit more update from these past dictators and philosophers, things like that. Obama's former Attorney General, Loretta Lynch, she called for blood in the streets. She did this in a video for the Senate Democrats. And again, I have this link in there for you. You can go watch the video. But at what point, we have to ask, does the average American wake up and realize the next stage of the revolution is more violence until control is taken away from anyone with any type of conservative bone in their body, and then the real slavery will begin. Slavery isn't gone in the world. Socialist nations still pumping and running slavery. Every kind of sex slavery, human trafficking you can think of is still going on, still being pushed and carried about. In Britain, they took away guns. As I mentioned before, the police don't even typically carry guns. One cop said there was, as I said, was stabbed. He was able to taser the guy. But now in Britain, they're jailing people for posts that they're putting on social media, for thought crimes. Think about that. Let that set in. Right? Everybody wants a peaceful world. Everybody would love a world with no violence, but we don't live in a world without sin. And, if we lose our guns, through all of this, remember, Christ is still on his throne. He never falls off of his throne. He never leaves. Even if we become persecuted, even if we get put on the chopping block, even if we are shot and killed, all that will be to the glory of God. It will be to honor him. So don't ever get overwhelmed by this information. Use it. so that you're wiser, you're seeking wisdom, right? You're seeking truth. Use it in that seeking for wisdom, in building your worldview. Don't fall apart. Don't fall under the weight that Satan would love to see you fall under as you think about and deal with this stuff. We have to deal with this. We have to talk to our kids about it. We have to talk with our family members about it. We're going to have to talk with our co-workers about it. But the hope through all this is Christ. It's the only hope. Sin is only fixed through Christ. The dying of oneself is only fixed through Christ, and we look and we look forward to our hope in Him and being with Him for eternity one day. So if we die today, guess what? Tomorrow we're with Him if we're in Christ. Now let me talk about Rules for Radicals with Saul Alinsky. Just to give you a little background to help you understand the thought process and how the violence has been tracked through history in America, in the American context, okay? Saul Alinsky lived from 1909 to 1972, and he was just kind of the ultimate community organizer, kind of the guy that really put feet to the idea of community organizing. He'd go on to be revered, as I mentioned earlier, by two of the most well-known community organizers of our time, Hillary Clinton and Barack Obama. Alinsky actually offered Hillary Clinton a job at one point, but she declined. She wrote about him in her thesis paper. Obama would sit under the Alinskyites to learn their organization, their organizing ways, and he went on to instruct others then in the ways of Alinsky. We're going to see him in Bill Ayers. I'm going to talk about Bill Ayers in the next, in part 3 of this. They're working together, okay? They're community organizers. They are hardcore Marxists. Saul Alinsky looked out for Saul Alinsky. He was as stable as water. Basically, he did whatever he felt like doing, and then he showed everyone else how to watch out for old number one, right? Well, Daniel Flynn notes that his flexibility to changing tactics rather than the rigid adherence to principle was the Alinskyite hallmark of successful activism. So he had no foundation. He had no moral center. His moral center was whatever Alinsky wanted, that's what Alinsky went for. In true socialistic and totalitarian fashion, in Rules for Radicals, Alinsky would say this. He said, the organizer should know and accept that the right reason is only, by the way, he doesn't even have a basis for right. Right for him is whatever he wants. So recognize that. The Christian worldview gives us a foundation for what's right, for what's wrong, a moral basis for everything. He's got nothing. He says the organizer should know and accept that the right reason is only introduced as a moral rationalization after the right end has been achieved, although it may have been achieved for the wrong reasons to achieve the right goals. Doesn't even have a basis for right and wrong. He should be able, with skill and calculation, to use irrationality in his attempts to progress toward a rational world. Where does rationality come from, Saul? Rationality comes from a rational God who gives us the ability to think logically, who planted brains in us, who gave us the ability to understand what is right and wrong. Romans tells us that his laws are written on our hearts. That's how we know what is right and wrong, Saul, not from your opining here. So everyone can assume that what Saul Alinsky meant by the right reason and the right goals, again, was simply what he wanted them to be. Daniel Flynn continues in his article. He says, these wrong reasons included violence. The subject was too touchy, and to bring it up was to invite misquotation and distortion. Von Hoffman writes in his biography, in private, though, he would say that violence has its uses. It did as the head of a CIO goon squad, and Alinsky later boasted of his Depression-era involvement with Chicago mobsters. He was literally working with Chicago mobsters. Enforcer Frank Nitti, he said, took me under his wing. He told Playboy this shortly before his death in 1972. There's 2 articles where he just kind of laid out his life to 2 different publications. He says, I called him the professor, and I became his student. This is Nitti, the mobster. Nitty's boys took me everywhere, showed me all the mob's operations, from gin mills and whorehouses and bookie joints to the legitimate businesses they were beginning to take over. Within a few months, I got to know the workings of the Capone mob inside and out. He coolly crowed about detached discussions of mafia hits with Nitty, telling Hugh Hefner's magazine, I learned a blank of a lot about the uses and abuses of power from the mob, lessons that stood me in good stead later on when I was organizing. So his rules for radicals became the playbook for today. Okay, 60s and 70s, riots, the Cloward-Piven strategy, the Obama and Hillary Clinton strategies for taking over America, destroying our nation, and remaking it into their image. He was a communist without ever officially joining the party. He was part gangster, part mafia, part communist, without officially being any of them. Even though he's learning from them, he's working with them, he's watching them. At one point he recommends who to bring in on a hit to kill somebody. So anyways, in a C-SPAN debate with Saul Alinsky's son at the Freedom Fest in 2017, Dinesh D'Souza pointed out that Saul Alinsky learned these tactics by hanging out with the mob. In the interview with Playboy and Harper's Magazine, 1971-1972, Alinsky said, from a very young age, I tried to figure out how I could get stuff for free without having to work for it. That's the socialist blueprint through and through. D'Souza goes on to explain how Alinsky developed a scam at the University of Chicago to eat in the dining halls without paying. And he would then hold seminars around the university to instruct others in how they could also get food without paying for it. This is a roadmap. We're watching this happen right now with the illegal immigrants coming across the border. We got Democrats going down there and sending people down there to help the immigrants cross the border. George Soros is bringing them up in buses. He's giving them food. He's giving them cell phones, and they're telling people how to evade our forces to get in the country and claim asylum and this and that. So I mean, this is just a roadmap that's hitting us in the face right now. He goes on to explain that later in life, when Alinsky got involved with organized crime, he liked how they were able to shake people down for money and things. He continued to utilize this model as he laid out his rules for radicals, and you can also see D'Souza talking about this in his documentary called Death of a Nation. Highly recommend it. Very, very helpful. So as I mentioned, Alinsky's tactics can be seen today utilized by Obama, enforcing Obamacare, just one of the small pieces. And he and Hillary proceed to shake down the insurance companies and the American people to gain governmental power over that part of the economy. And we're watching the Democratic presidential candidates right now promise even more, way more than Obama and Hillary originally were even promising. So this is a socialist dream come true. But this is the end of part 2. I know it's been long. Next one, I'm going to get into Antifa. And again, you want to support us, check out angryaptees.com, angryaptees.com, some fun t-shirts and stuff on there. And again, go and serve your king. Have a great day.
If you're interested in learning more, preparing yourself better to witness, go to the website eternityatstake.com. We have several series on there. One of them is Maps from the Ancients. It covers manuscripts, archaeology, prophecy, science, and the resurrection. How do we know the Bible can be trusted? It's great for a homeschool study, great for a Sunday school class, great for an adult or teen class as well. We also have the Light Project, where I look at 8 cults and world religions, examining them. What do they do with God, with Christ, with the Bible, with salvation, heaven, hell, and things like that? Check it out today. Thanks for listening.